Hey y'all, my name's Carl. This is a review of the new Bring Me the Horizon album, Ammo, and this is the very first review on this channel. And in coordination with my new podcast that I'm launching, the Mosh Talk podcast, I wanted to take some time to do a video review of this album and a few other albums that I'll be reviewing on the podcast. So if you're here from the podcast, thanks for watching. I appreciate that. And if you want to go check out the podcast, the link will be in the description. So, Bring Me the Horizon is a band that probably needs no introduction if you're familiar with any type of metalcore and post-hardcore music. They're legends in the scene. They've been a band for well over a decade, actually closer to 15 years now. And lately, they've been going through a bit of an identity crisis. We've seen them kind of switch it up a little bit. Their last full-length album, That's the Spirit, which came out a couple of years ago, was a drastic departure from the metalcore sound that brought them to prominence in the mid and late 2000s and early 2010s. We're talking about albums like Suicide Season and There Is a Hell and Sempiternal. These are considered some of the most essential metalcore records of the 2000s and 2010s, and yet That's the Spirit was such a drastically different album. It was pop influenced. There were big choruses and no breakdowns and no screaming. It was huge and different and kind of paid off for them in my mind. I like that record a lot. It took a while to grow on me. I wasn't a big Bring Me the Horizon fan when they were a metalcore band, but it was refreshing to hear that different take. And so now they've returned with this new album, Ammo, which is in that same vein of pop rock, EDM, electronic inspired music. And I have some different thoughts about this album as I did for That's the Spirit. My biggest problem, my first problem with Ammo, I think has to do with the sheer amount of material that's on this album. It clocks in over 50 minutes. There's, I think, 13 tracks on this album. Some of them are interludes, but there's quite a few tracks on this album that run in excess of 4, 5, almost 6 minutes. And some of these tracks aren't even full tracks. Some of them are just interludes woven in with some vocals and some harsh EDM type of drum and bass, electronic inspired sections that don't really achieve much in the grand scheme of things. From the very first track on this album, I Apologize If You Feel Something, it's abundantly clear that the band isn't really trying to achieve something so much as get out all of their thoughts in the runtime that they've given themselves. This opening track is 2+ minutes of just electronic blips and vocalizations, and there's nothing here to note or write home about as an intro to the record. And my biggest problem as it goes into the next track, Mantra, which was the first single from the album, is that it's clear that even when the band is trying to write songs that are a little more of a nod to their older music, Mantra has this heavy, distorted, kind of crunching guitar that dominates the track, and yet the passion isn't there, the drive isn't there, the emotive vocals that we've heard from Ollie Sykes in the past are completely gone on this track. The performances just seem bored, and like there's nothing really driving Ollie to give it his all on these tracks, and that problem shows up for me on a lot of these tracks. The song Nihilist Blues, which features Grimes, is 5.5 minutes long, and it's not until about the second minute of the song that it really starts to achieve anything from a growth standpoint. You know, there's this big rave section and this EDM drum and bass section, which I actually thought was kind of cool, with Grimes humming and whispering over it. I thought that was really cool, and yet it gets into Grimes' actual feature, which was stunning in and of itself to see that she was on the track listing, and ultimately her feature doesn't really add anything to the track. It's just her kind of singing, and it could have been Ollie singing this part. It could have been anyone else singing this part. It's kind of a wasted feature outside of her whispering and her singing kind of lower in the mix earlier and later in the song. Her actual feature doesn't really add anything of value to the track. And that was one of my biggest problems with the song Wonderful Life, which features Danny Filth from Cradle of Filth. Another surprising feature to see on this album. The feature itself doesn't really do anything for me or for the track. It's just kind of a wasted little moment to just have Danny Filth's name on the track listing. And the tracks that the band are working by themselves without features, it still feels like there's something totally missing here in the way of passion and drive. A lot of these songs feel cobbled together. The electronic parts are just, ripped from the radio rock playbook that you might hear a band like Imagine Dragons bring to the table. It's uninspired, it's bland. The vocal performances from Ollie, even when he is giving it, I guess, his all, it doesn't seem like he's really delivering on much of anything at all. There's no passion. The lyrics are cringeworthy and predictable. The song structures are cringeworthy and predictable. And I find myself throughout these tracks, halfway through the track listing, thinking that I've heard everything that this album is going to achieve in the way of song structure and in terms of saying things. And what I think really broke this album down for me to my least favorite parts of this album was just the songs that weren't, not even the electronic EDM songs, it was the songs that they were very clearly trying to go for a radio pop sound and just fail miserably. The execution is so poor, the attempts are shoddy. It's clear that they don't really have any versing in writing this kind of music. They didn't bring in any outside voices to say, hey, I'm experienced with writing pop music, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with writing pop music if that's what you want to do. And yet it feels like they couldn't be bothered to give it their all or listen to outside voices. They just kind of took a shot at writing pop music, and it didn't work out for them. There are songs on this album where the choruses are so just grating and predictable, and even by radio rock standards, don't achieve anything. I'm talking about songs like Medicine and Mother Tongue, which just are very bland and uninspired songs, much like the songs that I talked about earlier. Mother Tongue, to me, when I first heard that song and I first heard that chorus, I thought it was a shot at Phil Collins and the Tarzan soundtrack. That's what it sounded like to me. It was just this very predictable ballad with very generic lyrics, just totally lacking any real inspiration. I think that's what this album boils down to, is a lack of inspiration, a lack of drive, a lack of passion, a lack of willingness to step out of the box but do so in a way that was calculated and meticulous. These guys are known for being meticulous songwriters and having a lot of drive and passion for their craft, and it doesn't show up on this LP for me. So with all the bad things out of the way, and with the fact that this album for me is largely bad, I do have to give a couple of positive notes about songs like Wonderful Life and the closing track on this album, which is called I Don't Know What to Say. I like that song a lot, actually. That was the only track on the album that I had anything really nice to say about. The closing track, it is this very well put together, atmospheric, very very engrossing kind of closing track that really sums up the message that I think they were going for, that they failed to kind of bring up on the earlier tracks on the album. I did like Wonderful Life's ability to incorporate these buzzing, distorted, overdriven rock guitars that I thought I would have liked to hear more of on the album. Kind of a nod to their older music, not necessarily in the way of metalcore, but kind of fusing the punch and the edge of metalcore with some more radio rock and pop influence. And while I think that my biggest problem with this album is not that they made a pop album instead of a metalcore album. It's that they didn't bring any passion or drive to making a pop album. And it's that they have such a pompous attitude, like what shows up on the song Heavy Metal, the second to last song on the album, which is a critique of the fans that say that because they're not a metal band anymore, that their music isn't good anymore. And while I think that that take is not necessarily great, I think that criticizing a band solely because they decided to change their sound is a little contrived and misses the point. You also miss the point by condemning those fans that have been with you for 15 years that are disappointed that you're changing your sound and are not really doing the best with your new sound. It's perfectly legitimate criticism to say to this band, hey, I don't really like your new sound. It kind of feels phony and cobbled together and doesn't really do justice to your older stuff, versus just saying, hey, you're not a metal band anymore. I hate you for that. I think those are two completely different things, and yet it feels like the band is just blending those two types of people and their responses to this album together. So, what are my overall thoughts on this record? I think I kind of summed it up pretty well by saying that this album, it lacks drive, it lacks passion, it lacks that type of musicianship that I was accustomed to. Even as someone who wasn't a big fan of Bring Me the Horizon, I at least expected them coming into this album to bring something interesting or fresh to the table, and that doesn't show up for me on this album. If I had to give it a rating, I give it a I give it a very light 3 out of 10, and that is mostly due to the closing track that I liked a lot as an individual track, but in the scope of the record doesn't really salvage it beyond just being a good, maybe even great closing track, while the rest of the tracks are very mediocre at best and unlistenable at worst. So those are my thoughts on the new Bring Me the Horizon album. What are your thoughts on this album? I'm willing to have a discussion about this one, although I can feel some comments coming already about some of the things that I had to say. But, let's have a discussion. Go check out my podcast, the Mosh Talk Podcast, in which I talk a little more at length about the songs and my reactions to them. Follow me on Twitter at MoshXLife and on Instagram at MoshXLife. My name is Carl. Thank you for watching. I will see you again soon. Goodbye.